Hi there, friends on BookTube. I promise any day now I'm going to get an HD webcam and all of our lives are going to change. But until then, thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to do this quick video. I have some really exciting things to tell you about. So I just got this great book from the library, and it's called We Need New Names by No Violet Bulawayo. I don't know how many of you grew up going to libraries, but for me, it was such a formative experience standing in a library and recognizing what an enormous wealth of material and imagination was available to me in the world of reading and books. And I'm sure many of you, at least people who end up on BookTube, had similar experiences. So I got this book from the library, and it just arrived, and I'm super excited to read it. But before I tell you about it, I actually want to tell you about how I found out about it. Which is, I recently had this amazing opportunity to sit down with a friend of mine. His name is Fungai Tichawangana, and he is a journalist and an innovator from Zimbabwe. And he's currently doing a year-long fellowship at Harvard. Fancy, I know. So he and I sat down, and I wanted him to tell me a bit more about Zimbabwean fiction in English. And I wanted to know who were the authors I should look at, and what are some of the stories that he found really important and formative when he was growing up, and after that too. And so I thought I'd share some of what he said. I'm going to, throughout this discussion, mention to you some of those authors. I'll quote to you from kind of my conversation with him. And then finally, I will also leave a link in the info box to the kind of short wrap-up I did around this, so you can go and check out some of those books for yourself if you should so choose. Okay, so it actually turns out that Zimbabwe is a center for literary culture. They hosted the Zimbabwe International Book Fair for many years, which was one of the largest and most influential book fests in Africa. The Kane Prize for African Literature was first awarded at that fair. It also has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. To those who read the news headlines, though, they might be more familiar with Zimbabwe for its economic crisis, where they suffered enormous and runaway inflation, and that's something the country is still trying to recover from. So those are the news headlines, but let's talk about the fiction. So one of the things that Fungai told me about that really spoke to me strongly, and I've heard this from other members of my own family who grew up in post-colonial India, is that he grew up reading a lot of British fiction. And this isn't uncommon when you have that colonial history, because the syllabus in your school has been shaped by, the syllabus of another country and that history and traditions. So he grew up reading about, Dick and Jane and their cats and their dogs. And he said it wasn't until he was 15 that he really read a Zimbabwean author for class. And that author was Charles Mungoshi, who wrote a collection of short stories called Coming of the Dry Season. And I'll just quote Fungai here. He said, it was about little boys who looked like me, who were going through experiences like mine, and that just did things to my mind. And I never thought that was possible. So I think that speaks really powerfully to the ways that literature can place us within ourselves and our narratives and our own history, and how much reading is a part of how you form a notion of yourself. Coming of the Dry Season is a collection of short stories, like I said, and when I asked Fungai which stories stood out to him, he pointed to a story about two boys who try to kill a crow, and no matter how much they pelt it with stones, it just won't die. And he says that this story speaks to the desire for freedom and the need to be self-determining as a country that was so much a part of Zimbabwean thought at that time. Then he also pointed me to an author who's won a fair number of prizes, Petna Gapa, who wrote a collection of short stories called An Elegy for Easterly. And those stories feature characters and protagonists from various walks of life. They include a minister, a woman who lives in a well-off suburb, a woman who's been deemed insane, and every one of these stories kind of brings out issues from Zimbabwe's recent past. Then he pointed me to We Need New Names, and I was really drawn to the story because he said it's about a young woman who goes through a chaotic time with her family. They lose their home, and then she has the opportunity to come to the United States because of a relative who lives here. And Fungai said this is, about how her life changes, and it's the story of Zimbabweans who left in whatever way they could and didn't come back. And growing up myself within an immigrant family, I think this spoke to me. There are so many great stories about migration by various different contemporary authors, and they speak so profoundly to kind of what we try and bring with us as well as what we leave behind, and how it's never quite what we envision it will be. And so I was really excited to get this book, really excited to start reading it and understand a bit more about, her story. He also recommended The Hairdresser of Harare, which is about a young gay man trying to live in Zimbabwe, which is still a very homophobic society. A book called Nervous Conditions, which features a young woman named Tambu and explores some of the issues around gender and how the opportunities available to young men and women differ. He also pointed me to Butterfly Burning by Yvonne Vera and Harvest of Thorns by Shimmer Chinodia as two stories worth reading. So this was an amazing conversation. I loved sitting down with Fungai, talking about something we both loved, and kind of sharing this experience of literature and why it's important to us. Obviously, we touched on, the political and the economic, but I think we brought it home to how literature is this sort of empathetic and human experience, and in telling these sort of imaginative stories, and by bringing this lens of anecdote to bear in this way, it shows us something about experiences that statistics and news articles can't a lot of the time. So I'm really looking forward to reading this story, or to this novel, I should say. And if you have read it, and if you have other Zimbabwean authors you'd like to recommend, other post-colonial literature you have read that has kind of changed your life, please feel free to tell me about it in the comments. I'd love to hear about that. And hopefully when I finish this, I will do a quick wrap-up, kind of talking about my impressions and what I took away. Thanks so much, everyone. Great talking with you, and see you again soon.